In January 1995, 14 children boarded school bus number 47 for what should have been a routine ride home through the Minnesota countryside. A sudden blizzard hit. The bus never arrived. For 29 years, their disappearance remained one of the state's most haunting unsolved cases, until a satellite image in 2024 revealed something impossible. The bus wasn't where it was supposed to be. And what investigators found frozen beneath the ice would expose a truth more horrifying than anyone imagined. The morning of January 15th, 2024, started like any other for Michael Carson. As part of his pre-retirement hobby project, he was reviewing historical satellite imagery of his childhood region in northern Minnesota, tracking how the landscape had changed over the decades. It was nostalgic work, comparing images from the 1990s to present day, watching forests grow and lakes shift their boundaries. He was examining Whitefish Lake's evolution over the past 30 years when something caught his eye. 29 years of FEMA search and rescue work had trained him to spot anomalies, but this one made his coffee cup freeze halfway to his lips. There, beneath the crystal-clear ice of Whitefish Lake, was the unmistakable outline of a school bus. Mike stared at the high-resolution image on his monitor. Whitefish Lake was 50 miles north of Millbrook, Minnesota, 50 miles from where school bus number 47 had supposedly disappeared during the blizzard of January 23, 1995. 50 miles from where Mike Carson had lived his entire adult life with a guilt he'd never been able to shake. He should have been on that bus. Mike picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in 5 years. Sheriff Janet Mills answered on the second ring. "Mills here." "Janet, it's Mike Carson. I need to tell you something about the Millbrook school bus case." A long pause. "Mike, we've been through this. That case is cold. Has been for decades." "I found the bus. January 23rd, 1995. 12-year-old Michael Carson pressed his face against his bedroom window, watching the snow fall in thick, heavy flakes. His mother had already called the school twice that morning. "The fever's down to 101, she said into the kitchen phone. "But I think he should stay home one more day." Mike had been fighting the flu for 3 days. Any other time, he would have been thrilled to miss school. But today was different. Today was the day Mrs. Henderson was bringing her golden retriever to school for their unit on animal care. Today was the day Sarah Mitchell was supposed to give him an answer about the winter dance. Today was the day he watched his classmates climb onto bus number 47 for the last time. He remembered their faces pressed against the fogged windows as the bus pulled away from Millbrook Elementary, Tommy Rodriguez waving from the back seat, the Hartley twins arguing over who got to sit by the window, Sarah Mitchell with her blonde hair in the braids she always wore on Mondays. 14 kids, 1 driver, gone. The blizzard hit 2 hours later, transforming the Minnesota countryside into a white void. By evening, when bus number 47 failed to complete its route, the temperature had dropped to minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Sheriff Mills met Mike at the Millbrook Police Department at 6 a.m. She looked older than her 53 years, her gray hair pulled back in the same efficient ponytail she'd worn since taking over from her father 15 years ago. "Show me," she said without preamble. Mike spread the satellite images across the conference table. The bus was clearly visible beneath the ice, sitting upright on the lake bottom like a toy forgotten by a giant child. "Whitefish Lake," Mills said slowly. "That's nowhere near the route." "Exactly." Mike pulled out a yellowed map of Millbrook County. Bus number 47's afternoon route went from the elementary school, out County Road 12, past the Henderson farm, then back into town via Mill Street. Total distance, 18 miles. Whitefish Lake is 50 miles northwest. Mills studied the images. Could the driver have gotten lost in the storm? Bob Hayes had been driving that route for 12 years. He could have done it blindfolded. Mike's voice was flat. Besides, look at this. He pointed to a second satellite image, this one showing the lake's shoreline. There's a clear path from the main road down to the water. Trees are pushed aside, like something heavy was driven through them deliberately. Mills leaned back in her chair. You think Hayes drove the bus into the lake on purpose? I think Bob Hayes was the only person who knew what really happened on January 23rd, 1995, and he's been dead for 10 years. The cruiser's heater hummed as they drove through the Minnesota countryside. Mike stared out at the snow-covered fields, each one a potential grave that had never been searched. Tell me about the original investigation, Mills said, her eyes on the road. Mike had memorized every detail. 6:47 p.m., Mrs. Rodriguez calls. Tommy's not home. By 8 p.m., 13 more calls. Parents getting frantic. And the search? County Road 12. That's where Hayes should have been. Mike's voice was flat. Teams found nothing, not even tire tracks in the snow. Mills navigated around a pothole. The silence stretched between them. They gave up too easy, Mike finally said, or someone wanted them to. The implication hung in the air as they drove deeper into the wilderness. Mike thought about his 12-year-old self, safe in his bedroom while his classmates. Hayes's wife called that same night, he continued, pushing away the image. Said he never came home. Search and rescue figured the snow buried everything. Said they'd look again in spring. But spring came and went. 29 springs came and went. Mike's hands clenched in his lap. No bus, no bodies, no answers. They drove in silence until Mills asked the question Mike had been dreading. Why weren't you on the bus that day? Mike stared out the passenger window. Flew. My mom made me stay home. Lucky break. Was it? Mike's voice was barely above a whisper. I've spent 30 years wondering if I could have changed something. If I'd been there, maybe Hayes wouldn't have done whatever he did. Whitefish Lake stretched before them like a sheet of black glass. The ice was thick enough to walk on, but thin enough in places to see clear through to the bottom. And there, 20 feet down in the crystal-clear water, sat school bus number 47. The yellow paint was faded but intact. The emergency exit was clearly visible at the rear. Most chilling of all, the bus was sitting upright, as if it had been gently lowered into place rather than crashed through the ice. Jesus, Mills whispered. Mike was already on his phone, calling in the dive team from Duluth. We'll need sonar equipment, underwater cameras, and a crane capable of lifting 12 tons out of a frozen lake. As they waited for the equipment to arrive, Mills walked the shoreline while Mike studied the scene. The path from the road to the water was even more obvious from ground level. Trees had been pushed aside or broken off completely. Deep ruts in the frozen ground showed where something heavy had been dragged. Mike, Mills's voice carried across the ice. She was standing near a cluster of birch trees, staring at something carved into the bark. When he reached her, Mike felt his stomach drop. Carved into the white bark, about chest high, were letters. The carving showed multiple layers of cutting, some gouges deep and weathered, others fresher, as if someone had returned year after year to recarve the same message. Mills photographed the carving from every angle. Boulevard Bob Hayes. Someone's been maintaining this message, Mike observed, running his finger along the various depths of cut marks. Look at the different weathering patterns. Some of these cuts are decades old, others maybe just a few years. Someone who survived, Mills said quietly. Someone who's been coming back here, trying to keep the message alive. The dive team arrived at noon. Mike paced the shoreline, his breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. 3 hours to set up. 3 hours while the bus sat there holding its secrets. When the first diver descended, Mike's chest tightened. 29 years of wondering about to end. "Visual on the vehicle," crackled Sarah Chen's voice through the radio. The grainy monitor showed bus number 47's front end. Door closed, windshield intact, no crash damage, too clean, too perfect. Moving to emergency exit, the camera panned. Mike's stomach dropped as the rear door came into view, hanging open like a mouth screaming underwater. "Jesus," Mills whispered beside him. Inside the bus, shapes, small shapes still strapped to seats. Confirming multiple deceased, Chen's voice was steady, professional. Estimate 12 to 13 individuals. Mike closed his eyes. 12 to 13. The math that had haunted him for 3 decades. Driver's seat shows skeletal remains, adult male, Bob Hayes, finally found. Wait. Chen's excitement cut through the radio static. "There's something else. Waterproof container near the driver's position." Mike couldn't breathe. The laminated documents spread across the table like evidence of a nightmare made real. Hayes's waterproof markers had preserved every damning detail. January 15th. Final preparations complete. Mills read the words, but Mike was already flipping through the pages. Maps, timing charts, names, 14 names. His classmates reduced to items on a shopping list. Payment on delivery, $35,000 per head. The math was simple, horrific, but simple. Human trafficking, Mills said, but Mike was already reading the final entry. Hayes's handwriting increasingly erratic. Storm worse than expected, kids getting suspicious, Tommy asking questions, Sarah crying, can't control them, buyers unreachable, plan blown. Mike's hands shook. It wasn't supposed to end this way. What do you mean? Hayes was supposed to deliver them alive, but the storm... Mike's voice cracked. 14 kids died because Bob Hayes panicked. Mills was already reaching for her radio. We need State Crime Lab. This is now a homicide investigation. But Mike wasn't listening. He was thinking about Tommy Rodriguez's wave from the back seat, about Sarah Mitchell's blonde braids, about how close he'd come to being name number 15 on Hayes's list. Mike stared at the documents as the pieces fell into place. It was never supposed to end this way. Hayes was taking them somewhere else, probably a handoff point where they'd be transferred to whoever was buying them. But the storm was too severe, the kids started panicking, and Hayes realized he was going to get caught. So he drove the bus into the lake, Mills said, eliminated the evidence, made it look like an accident. Mike felt sick. 14 kids died because Bob Hayes couldn't complete his delivery. Mills was already on her radio, calling for backup units and the State Crime Lab. We need to process this scene as a homicide, multiple homicides. As the sun set over Whitefish Lake, Mike stood alone on the ice, looking down at bus number 47. For 29 years, he'd carried guilt over missing school that day. Now he realized the horrible truth. His fever had probably saved his life. But it didn't save Tommy Rodriguez, who'd waved from the back seat. It didn't save the Hartley twins, who'd argued over the window seat. It didn't save Sarah Mitchell, who would never get to give him an answer about the winter dance. Mike's phone rang at 3 a.m., cutting through his insomnia like a blade. He'd been staring at the ceiling for hours, haunted by images of the carving. Those desperate letters scratched into birch bark. Help us. BH did this. Different depths, different weathering patterns. Someone had been maintaining that message, someone who survived. Without fully waking up, he was already pulling on his clothes, grabbing his keys. The truck started on the second try, headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness as he drove back to Whitefish Lake. The carving looked different in the harsh beam of his flashlight. Ancient gouges overlaid with fresher cuts, a palimpsest of desperation, rewritten every few years by hands that refused to let the truth die. His phone buzzed, Mills answering on the first ring despite the ungodly hour. "It's 3 a.m., Carson." "One of them lived," the words tumbled out. "Someone survived that night. They've been coming back here, maintaining that carving for 29 years. Silence on the other end. Then, "Mike, we counted 13 bodies in that bus plus Hayes. That matches." "No." Mike's breath formed clouds in the frigid air. 14 kids were supposed to be on that bus. We recovered 13 victims. Someone's missing. A long pause. "You're saying one of the kids escaped?" "I'm saying one of the kids got away, and they've been trying to tell us what happened ever since." The next morning, Mills ran the numbers again. According to school records, 15 children were supposed to be on bus number 47 that day. 14 were confirmed missing. One was sick at home, Michael Carson. But the dive team had recovered only 13 child victims from the bus. "We're missing someone," Mills confirmed. "Question is, who didn't get reported missing that night?" Mike had spent the night going through the original case files. "Look at this. Mrs. Rodriguez reported Tommy missing at 6:47 p.m. Mrs. Henderson called about Beth at 6:52. Mrs. Mitchell called about Sarah at 7:03. He spread the reports across the table. 13 families called that night, but according to the attendance records, 14 kids should have been on the bus. Mills studied the paperwork. So who didn't get reported missing? Mike found the answer in the school's emergency contact database. Jason Keller, 14 years old, lived with his grandmother after his parents died in a car crash the year before. Grandmother had advanced Alzheimer's. She wouldn't have known to call when he didn't come home, Mills realized. Jason Keller, Mike said. That's our survivor. 2 days of searching databases, 2 days of following digital breadcrumbs through decades of bureaucratic maze. Jason Keller's name appeared in fragments, arrest records, rehab admissions, a string of addresses that painted a picture of a man running from something that would never stop chasing him. The halfway house in St. Paul was their final stop. Mike and Mills found him on the front porch, cigarette trembling between fingers that had seen too much, survived too much. 39 years old with the hollow eyes of someone who'd been carrying the weight of 13 dead friends since he was 14. Jason Keller? Mills showed her badge, but Jason was already nodding, cigarette frozen halfway to his mouth. You found the bus. Not a question. A statement from someone who'd been waiting his entire adult life for this moment. The halfway house common room smelled of stale coffee and broken dreams. Jason wrapped both hands around his mug to stop the shaking. I've been waiting 29 years for someone to believe me. His voice was steady, but Mike could see the decades of doubt in his eyes. How many times had he told this story to doctors, social workers, police officers who looked at him like he was crazy? January 23rd, Jason began. Hayes said there was a tree down on County Road 12. But Tommy Rodriguez was smart. He knew we were going the wrong way. The story unfolded like pages from a nightmare. Hayes getting agitated. The gun. The drive to Whitefish Lake. Hours parked by the water while Hayes tried desperately to reach someone on his CB radio. He kept saying he was sorry, Jason whispered, over and over. I'm sorry, but sorry doesn't stop a bus from sinking. Mike leaned forward. How did you get out? Emergency exit. Right when we hit the water, I yanked the handle. Door opened just as the ice broke. Jason's eyes went distant. I tried to help the others, but he didn't finish. He didn't need to. I was sitting in the back, right next to the emergency exit, Jason continued. When I felt the bus start moving toward the water, I yanked the door handle. It opened just as we hit the ice. The bus had broken through the thin ice at the lake's edge and started sinking immediately. Jason had jumped out into waist-deep water, but the shock of the cold had nearly killed him. I tried to help the others, but the door was underwater within seconds. I could hear them screaming inside, but the bus was sinking too fast. Jason had struggled to shore and collapsed in the snow, hypothermic and in shock. When he came to, hours later, the lake had refrozen over the bus. I tried to walk home, but I got lost in the storm. A trucker found me on Highway 2 around midnight, nearly frozen to death. Took me to the hospital in Duluth. Mills leaned forward. What happened at the hospital? Jason's laugh was bitter. Doctors said I was delusional from hypothermia. Social workers said I was making up stories to cope with trauma. Nobody believed that a school bus driver would murder 13 kids. They thought you were having a breakdown over your parents' deaths, Mike realized. Spent 3 months in psychiatric care. By the time I got out, everyone had moved on. The official story was that bus number 47 got caught in the storm and was buried under snow. Case closed. But Jason had never stopped trying to tell his story. There was one person who believed me, he said quietly. Father Mackenzie, the hospital chaplain. He listened to my whole story, took notes, even went to the police. What happened? Mills asked. Mackenzie talked to Sheriff Davidson, Mills's predecessor. But Hayes's family had political connections in the county. Davidson said there wasn't enough evidence to reopen the case, especially based on the traumatic fantasies of a disturbed child. A month later, Mackenzie got transferred to a parish in North Dakota. The tree carving, Mike said. That was you. Jason nodded. First time was right after I got out of the psychiatric facility. I hitchhiked to the lake and carved the message. Figured someone would eventually see it and investigate. You've been going back, Mills observed. Every few years. Weather and time would fade the carving, so I'd make it deeper, clearer. Always hoping that someday someone would find the bus and the message would make sense. Jason pulled out a worn photograph from his wallet. 13 children standing in front of Millbrook Elementary, Jason among them. These were my friends, he said. They died because I couldn't save them. The least I could do was make sure someone remembered what really happened. Back at the Millbrook Police Department, Mills opened a federal investigation into the trafficking network that Bob Hayes had been working with. The bank account information from Hayes's waterproof documents led to financial transactions in Minnesota and Wisconsin. Mike returned to his work at FEMA, but he couldn't let go of the case. In his spare time, he researched similar disappearances from the mid-1990s, focusing specifically on school bus incidents during severe weather. What he found was concerning, but not the massive conspiracy he'd initially feared. Mike called Mills with his findings. I found 3 other cases that match the pattern. All in the upper Midwest, all during major storms, all involving drivers with financial problems. How many children total? Mills asked. Mike did the math. Bus number 47 in Minnesota, 13 victims. A bus in Wisconsin, 11 children. 1 in Iowa, 12 children. And 1 in North Dakota, 10 children. Total 46 missing children over 3 years. It was still a horrific number, but more believable than the hundreds Mike had initially calculated. The federal investigation revealed a small but deadly trafficking operation that had operated across 4 states between 1994 and 1997. Bus drivers, all facing serious financial difficulties, had been recruited to deliver children to a buyer network willing to pay premium prices for young victims. The operation had been simple but effective, using severe weather events as cover for the disappearances. Local authorities, overwhelmed by storm-related emergencies, had assumed the missing buses were weather-related accidents. Bob Hayes had been one of 4 drivers recruited by Vincent Torelli, a Chicago businessman who coordinated the trafficking network. Phone records showed Hayes had been in contact with Torelli in the days leading up to January 23, 1995. Bank records revealed that the network had grossed approximately $1.6 million over 3 years. Most disturbing of all, the investigation found evidence that 3 of the 4 bus operations had been successfully completed. Hayes's operation was the only one that had ended in the deaths of the victims. 33 children had been successfully trafficked. Their fates remained unknown. The federal investigation led to arrests in 3 states. Vincent Torelli had died in a car crash in 2001, but 2 of his associates were still alive. The surviving bus driver from the Iowa case, now 68 years old, was arrested at his retirement home in Florida. Jason Keller testified before a federal grand jury, finally getting the chance to tell his story to people who not only believed him, but treated him as a hero for preserving the evidence all these years. The publicity generated by the case led to other survivors coming forward. Family members who had always doubted the official explanations for their children's disappearances, and even one other survivor from the Wisconsin bus who had been similarly dismissed as traumatized and delusional. For Mike Carson, the resolution brought a kind of peace. The guilt he'd carried for 29 years hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into something else, a determination to make sure no other children were forgotten. He left his job at FEMA and started a nonprofit organization dedicated to investigating cold cases involving missing children. The organization's first office was in Millbrook, Minnesota, in a building overlooking the elementary school where bus number 47 had made its final pickup. On January 23, 2025, exactly 30 years after the disappearance, Millbrook unveiled a memorial to the 13 children who had died on bus number 47. Jason Keller spoke at the dedication ceremony, reading the names of his former classmates, Tommy Rodriguez, who had waved from the back seat, Beth Henderson, who loved animals, Sarah Mitchell, who never got to give an answer about the winter dance, the Hartley twins, who had argued over the window seat, 9 other children who had trusted their bus driver to take them home safely. Mike Carson also spoke that day, addressing the crowd of survivors, family members, and law enforcement officials who had worked to solve the case. For 29 years, these children were lost, he said, not just physically, but lost to bureaucracy, lost to assumptions, lost to a system that preferred convenient explanations over difficult truths. He looked out over the crowd, finding Jason Keller in the front row. But they were never forgotten. Someone kept their memory alive, kept trying to tell their story, kept believing that someday someone would listen. Mike paused, thinking of that fever that had kept him home from school on January 23, 1995, the guilt that had shaped his entire adult life. "We can't bring them back," he continued, "but we can make sure their deaths meant something. We can make sure no other children disappear into silence." Today, Mike Carson's organization has investigated over 200 cases of missing children. They've solved 43 of them, bringing closure to families who had given up hope and putting criminals behind bars who thought they'd escaped justice. Jason Keller works as a counselor at the organization, helping other survivors of childhood trauma find their voices and tell their stories. He's been sober for 3 years and has found peace in turning his survival into purpose. The trafficking network that killed the children on bus number 47 has been dismantled, but the fight against child exploitation continues around the world. And somewhere in northern Minnesota, Whitefish Lake has frozen over again for another winter. But the secret it kept for 29 years has been revealed. The children who died there are no longer lost, they are remembered, in memory of all the missing children whose stories have yet to be told.